Hello and welcome to HBR Talk. Is that right? It's 340. Okay. HBR Talk 340. For some reason, my favorite
2:30,
typing
I
finger
thought.
is. You're right. It's 2:30. How do I get? Oh, I know what I did.
Oh, okay.
But yeah. Looking at the wrong thing. But my favorite typing finger is twice the size at the tip right now too. So I'm still bandaged. So in any case, the letter is open, but is the case closed? Is our title tonight. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with Nonsense Annihilator, Lauren B., Badger in Chief, Allison Tiemann, and the Doge in Charge, Brian Martinez, who is here to help me out because I'm still rustier than the gears in the establishment media's fabulous, faith-inducing propaganda machine. And tonight we're going to examine one of the greasier segments of that machine. But first, we got to do what we got to do. As always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthetip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can still find your way to all of our content, as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. And here we go, guys. This is the story that never ends. It just goes on and on, my friends. We thought it settled when a verdict was handed down, but we forgot this is the timeline of clowns. Seriously, though, feminists are never going to let this drop. And we're here tonight to talk about why. You guys ready to dig in?
Yeah, and you really are speaking my language because I'm just thinking to myself, how are we still talking about fucking Amber Heard? Like, can she just go away already? I for one am tired of it.
Because she's the biggest single counterexample to the feminist narrative ever.
Yeah, and they can't let it drop because if they let it drop, if they move on, this becomes acknowledgement, right? That's a real thing. Women do sometimes abuse men, and the other thing is that it acknowledges the complexity of bidirectional abuse. Like, this is a situation where what we've talked about that when women initiate and they push men past their point of being able to be patient and being able to be, even-handed and so on, where way beyond where they should have to, like to the point where it doesn't matter whether they should have to or not because they can't. They're going to get yelled at. They're going to get screamed at. They're going to see the men reacting. They're going to get pushback. And even then, you look at the actual story, the actual descriptions of what's confirmed to have happened, the video, the texts, everything. Depp kept a lot more self-control than any woman would have in that situation.
Well, would have been expected to. The thing is, he had unbelievable patience with her, and he, as far as I can tell, he got short with her, and definitely he did yell back at some points, or at least insult her. Although you can sort of almost defensively, but the abuse was it was mostly one direction. And if there was any abuse coming from him, it was under incredible provocation.
Under U.S. law, they will consider it two-way domestic violence if a couple both yells at each other, even if one of them is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's unfortunate. But the thing is that her violence was she was
violent.
She was
Right.
sexually violent, sexually coercive, physically violent. She was emotionally abusive. You could even make the argument she was financially abusive. So I mean, she was the primary abuser in the relationship from everything that I've seen and everything that she's admitted to. So, and if, like I said, if there's something going back from his end, it is because of unbelievable levels of provocation, and it is nowhere near the same level as what she did.
Exactly. And see, this is the thing. When we talk about bidirectional violence, usually we're talking about bidirectional domestic violence that is violent in both directions. In the United States, our law, the Violence Against Women Act, doesn't differentiate between a man yelling at a woman and a man slapping a woman. He's considered to be a perpetrator if he yells at her.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Like in '95, I had a friend in university that was arrested, charged, convicted, and then went on appeal like a year later because the ex-girlfriend that broke into his apartment to beat him with his own possessions said she did so because she was afraid of him. She did it because she was mad that since they were breaking up, he was not going to pay. He was going to stop paying her bills in a couple of months. He gave her time to get a job and everything.
Wow.
And
sounds very similar to this situation.
Yeah, he was just basically like, look, I can't do this anymore. I'm paying for my college. You're not even acting like a girlfriend. Like, and we have no chemistry. Like we're not together. I'm just paying your bills. I'm just, I think today he would have used the phrase sugar daddy, but I don't think I ever heard that phrase back in the 90s, the early 90s. It probably existed. But that situation, there's things about that reminds me of this. But VAWA was new. So a lot of us really didn't understand what was going on there. And it just blew everybody's mind that she could break into his place and she could beat him, and she fractured his skull and his wrist. And he got arrested. Not her. She did not get arrested because she had a key. She wasn't supposed to have a key. She had a key.
I have a relative, like a young man in the family, who had a girlfriend, and while they were staying together, he had, I guess, co-signed on or was on her cell phone bill. So he got her cell phone bills, and they broke up, and he wanted the cell phone back because she was racking up enormous charges on it that he couldn't afford. So he went, and I don't think he went to her place, but they were in the same place, and he confronted her about it, and he grabbed the cell phone, and she kicked him in the balls in response, and then called the cops. The cops came and arrested him, and on the way to taking him to jail, they realized he might die. So they took him to the hospital instead. Wow. And he may actually be infertile now as a result of her assault. And he got charged with domestic violence, except they're going to expunge. They decided that they would expunge his record if he went to anger management.
Wow.
All because this woman stole money from him by using a cell phone that he had signed on to pay for, which was his cell phone at that point, and wouldn't give it back to him. And he grabbed for the cell phone, and she assaulted him as a result of that. Kicked him in the groin, which is an assault. It's not funny by any stretch of the imagination. And he went to jail for it, or almost went to jail, except that the cops, I guess, took mercy on him when they realized, oh shit, he might die.
No.
In custody if we don't take him to the hospital. So she assaulted him to the point where they were worried he was going to die, but he still got charged with domestic violence. This system is absolutely, there is no alibi for it. There is absolutely no way that you can excuse it. And at this point, if you don't recognize how absolutely biased against men, it is because you have chosen idiocy as a lifestyle.
Well, and I think these people do recognize, and I think they're afraid this case is going to bring that out. And like we could probably tell 1,000 stories like that. And like with the story that you just told, once upon a time, I would have advised men, just advised them, don't handle that situation by confronting, handle that situation by canceling the contract and getting a new phone. But you can't even do that anymore. At this point, my suggestion to men would be to get a lawyer and go through the legal process of reporting the phone stolen. Because if you just cut off the contract under some aspects, especially in the United States, there are some states that will do this. You're not together anymore, but you were paying her bills. It's financial abuse to cut her off.
Yep.
And like, that's bullshit.
Yep.
It's bullshit that men should be expected to pay any woman's bills in 2022, right? And
Yep.
I'm sorry, but we've had equal pay since the 60s, as long as we do equal work.
Well, what this,
so why should anybody be paying our bills?
What this particular case, the Depp versus Heard case, proves is Depp is a multimillionaire. He's a beloved celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
He has contacts, in the entertainment industry. So he is, in all intents and purposes, he is a powerful man. And for 6 years, he was destroyed by one woman's lies. And he had to use every bit of his power just to oppose the word of a woman. That is he is in the top 1% of men. And he barely got out of this alive.
Yeah.
You think about that. If there are any women listening today, think about that. The top 1% of men. And he, it was the skin of his teeth. If it had gone the other way, he would have been screwed. Nobody would have believed him. It would have been the end.
This is the reality of female perpetrated domestic violence.
It's not just the reality of female perpetrated domestic violence. It's the reality of how the system enables what women say about men, how it enables their voice, how a man who could be in the top 1% could still have almost lost his life to a woman's word. This is the situation we're in. No man on the planet, no man is safe from this. None of them are.
I want to point out, while we're talking about this, I want to point out, on his side, very little media, if any, came out to even give his side of the story at all. On her side, every media source, every big establishment media source, shamed people for not believing her, published everything that she said without question. She was elevated and solicited. Like the ACLU, it's not just media, the ACLU came out for her. They're the ones that had her write her original narrative there. So this isn't just a woman can say things and defame a guy and the law doesn't support him. She had an entire network of essentially media hitmen that hammered it home. She had an entire network of verbal thugs, would be the best way to put it.
Her PR campaign.
Right. And it's a different story because she's famous and he's famous. But even going back to guys like 7 Years in Hell guy, or my childhood friend whose ordeal went on for a quarter of a century, has gone on for a quarter of a century now, because his ex, their kids are grown, they've been separated for a long time. She still occasionally pulls shit. Right? They don't have any reason to have anything to do with each other anymore. She has every reason in the world to have moved on. She still pulls shit. Right? So 25 years now. More than 25 years now, actually. And like that, those guys, they don't, their exes don't have clout, but they still have that media machine. If one of their stories ever became slightly more public, right, or even just feminists listening to us, how dare you not believe that woman?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Because then it becomes, if you don't believe Amber Heard, if you don't believe this one woman, then you're silencing the voice of every other victim out there.
And it's the establishment. It's not just a narrative. It's not just feminist voices. It's the mainstream establishment, big conglomerate corporate media. It's ABC, NBC, MSNBC, I guess, PMSNBC, right? It's Reuters, AP, used to be big news organizations, worldwide news organizations. It's Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. Like if you start talking about these stories, the first time I was shadow banned from Reddit was for talking about the 7 years in hell case. And that was in 2013. That wasn't a year ago. Right? And all of these organizations, women who lie, who make these allegations, who fuck over men for fun and profit,
shits and giggles,
and gold doubloons. They have a network of power that is essentially an information mafia. Not just social attitudes, not just women's organizations, Time magazine. They have everything. And yet what are we going to hear today? Because the propaganda machine didn't work on some people, because it did work on many people, but because it didn't work on some people, because we could actually watch the court case, because we could actually see how unconvincing Amber Heard was, because we could actually watch her in real time look creepy and domineering and dishonest and fake and make up our minds for ourselves. And she's the victim. She's a victim of not being able to propagate a lie 100% effectively. Only about 40% maybe effectively. That's pretty scary. So shall we get into the letter?
So first, because I figured you guys were going to jump into the letter now.
Yeah.
I do have a super chat and a super chow. So Catherine Scully gives us a super chat, and it is of a pair giving us a fist bump. And she donates $3 Canadian. So thank you, Catherine. I'll fist bump you right back. And then for super chows, we got Meredith G, and I think this is actually a really good point that she's making here. This is why I wanted to get it in. Who gives us $5 and says, HBR Talk 230, remember the ACLU intended to use Amber Heard's Washington Post letter to help get VAWA, that's the Violence Against Women Act, renewed in 2018. So they were going to use her letter about, that she wrote for the Washington Post to help get VAWA renewed in 2018. Heard was replaced by Angelina Jolie, but that doesn't mean that they can abandon Heard entirely, because she breaks the narrative they need for their public policy. So this comes back to, was this all about politics and
Oh, yeah.
legislation and all of that. So
Well, here's what you got to understand, and this is why all these organizations are coming out with this letter too. Right? And I'll give you a little brief history. Before we had VAWA, right, we had the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which VAWA replaced by update. So the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act is the law that established the 24-hour hotline for abuse victims. It established shelters. It established that if cops are called to the scene of a domestic violence incident, they can't just be like, well, it's domestic, we don't have to do anything. They have to take it seriously. It is the reason why mandatory arrest policies came about, and those weren't necessarily a good thing, because there's a lot of instances where people are allowed in an argument and then the neighbors call, but there's not actually any domestic violence happening. And there's even been instances where cops have been called to the scene of a home where loud sex has been taking place, and the neighbors thought it was domestic violence, and somebody gets arrested and they have to go to court and be like, no, Your Honor, we were just fucking really loud, we're sorry, but in any case, so that was the original law. The original law had a stipulation in it that organizations that ran domestic abuse shelters could not discriminate on the basis of sex. So if a domestic abuse victim came to them as a man and said, I got to get out of my home, my wife is throwing frying pans at me, I'm going to be killed, or I'm going to be in trouble for defending myself, I've got to get out, they would have to help him get out. And feminist organizations continued to lobby for another 10 years after the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984 to get the Violence Against Women Act, written by Joe Biden, of 1994, which gendered everything. It changed the way funding was done as well. So instead of just funding the shelters and the hotline and everything, the federal government funded feminist research specifically designed to prove that this is a gendered problem based on the beliefs laid out in the Duluth model. It funded Duluth model training for shelter personnel. It funded Duluth model training for police departments, prosecutors, courts, and court personnel. And funding incentivized policy changes that instead of just, a policy of mandatory arrest, the policy would be mandatory arrest of the male in the conflict, if it's a heterosexual conflict, and to avoid arresting women, and mandatory treatment of the situation as if it fits the Duluth model, regardless of whether it does or not. And with all of the research being funded and all of the education being funded, that education, that propaganda that they're calling education, somebody has to teach those classes. Somebody has to create those training materials. Somebody has to print those up. Those have to be designed and written and everything. And every step of that is a job that makes money for somebody. So there is a huge profit machine around the myth that domestic violence is something patriarchal that men use to keep women in their place, when something like 67% of it is bidirectional, and bidirectional includes anything from both hitting each other to she beats the hell out of him and he yells at her for it. Right? That's considered bidirectional partner violence. And then of the violence that is one way, 2/3 of that, 70% of that, is female perpetrated. That's the woman engaging in violence and the man not retaliating, not defending himself, not doing anything. And since all a man has to do to be considered a perpetrator, all a man has to do to be considered a perpetrator is not pay her bills or yell at her, tell her what to do, like, stop hitting me. That's domestic violence. That's all he has to do. The 7 years in hell guy, his ex-wife's second husband, did 18 months for running away from her. Because in order to get out of the room where she was throwing like heavy knickknacks and small appliances at him and stuff, he had to go past her to get out the door. And his shoulder touched her shoulder briefly on the way out. That was an 18-month offense. He was the abuser because he didn't put up with having that stuff thrown at him. Like stuff that, if it hits you like 2 or 3 pounds thrown, hits you in the head, could kill you. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at here is this. They are defending massive profits and massive political power. And VAWA gets reauthorized like every 2 years. It's a bipartisan bill in terms of its original passage and getting reauthorized. And reauthorization of it is bipartisan every year. And they never debate whether or not it should be reauthorized. They only debate what should be in it, whether or not it should, like they put a clause in it, a non-discrimination clause in it, but it doesn't prevent any discrimination at all. They can still say this shelter specifically that's funded by VAWA only helps women. And they can still say, yes, we get funding to help women file false allegations, and it doesn't stop us from getting funding.
I know at the risk of offending a whole bunch of fake people, thank God for the trans rights movement. Because it's the only thing that's going to challenge this crap.
I don't think it will.
You don't?
No. No, because the minute a trans woman becomes in conflict with a biological woman in a situation where there is domestic violence, she becomes a he.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
They can't even be consistent about their own.
Yeah, no.
It's just, I don't know. I just find this incredibly depressing.
It is.
Because it's just, why does society hate men so much? Dismiss men so much and treat them as completely expendable? And I realize, like, why would I expect any different? If you've ever watched or read about what happened to men in World War I in particular, like that was the first genocide that led to all of the other genocides of the 20th century. All of the other people who stood up and said, we can solve social problems by killing a whole bunch of people. That makes a lot of sense. That was World War I. That was the basis of that. Yeah. Because they literally allowed men to walk into a hail of bullets and gas and die. Like one of the offensives, for example, Somme, they would go over the top and they would stop being able to advance because the moment they went over the top, they would be mowed down. So there would be dead bodies filling the trenches, and they kept commanding them to go. I mean, think about that. Think about going through something so horrific in a society based on that, because in a lot of ways our sense of nationalism and a lot of our institutions are based on that level of horrific sacrifice in war. And we are people who would do that to men. If we would do that to men, if we could justify doing that to men to force them into that situation and not at any point stop and say, hey, you know what? This makes no goddamn sense. We can't continue to do this. Because that's what happened. We just continued to do it for 4 years. 4 years.
There's a manner in which we do that to men. As a society, we do that to men in regard to every big logistical issue that is involved in having a civilization, in keeping communities running and smoothly and safe. It's why when you look at workplace deaths, the vast overwhelming majority of workplace deaths are deaths of men. And if you look at injuries, it's not that different. The majority of workplace injuries are injuries of men. And if you look at where those injuries happen, It's traffic accidents involved in the transport of goods. It's slips, trips, and falls that take place in construction work. It's electrical fires. It's men getting shocked by live wires when they're in the process of making things or tearing things down or repairing things, or basically keeping the electricity going. Things falling on them. My grandfather, the way he met my grandmother was he was injured when they dropped a cement drainage ditch liner on him, and it crushed his leg from the hip to the ankle, and he never walked right again after that. Grandma was the nurse that took care of him in the hospital.
Yeah.
Which, like, that, even that, today, my grandfather would be called a sexual harasser for asking her out.
It's absolutely like this society. And for example, like we wouldn't have trains. Every mile of train track has a death toll of men laying it down. So a lot of our infrastructure in society has a death toll of men. We just say, well, if men are going to die, getting to the moon had a death toll of men.
Well, hell, even with the fucking World Cup, when they go and build the stadiums, when they do the Olympics, when they go and build these stadiums, there's mostly men that die in the building of these things. So this is just for our entertainment.
We sacrifice men to build our infrastructure. We sacrifice men in the most absurd way. The World War I was a failure of, diplomacy, of strategy, of politics. And we allowed a generation of men to run into a wood chipper because we couldn't solve that problem any other way. And then we didn't just immediately stop and say, no, that we shouldn't continue to do this. No, we just kept going because it was men. Because you're absolutely right. We encounter a logistical problem, and what do? We say, well, let's throw some men's bodies onto it. And then we have the feminist movement turning around and doing exactly the same thing. There's some kind of logistical problem in our psyche, in our society, so let's just sacrifice men to it. Giving women equal rights, creating a logistical problem in society, well, we'll just sacrifice men. So is it even frickin' possible to have a society that treats men with the modicum of frickin' decency and care? And I know some people will get angry at me because I'm getting fucking angry or will be upset or not like it, but this really, really pisses me off.
Yeah, I mean, if you're...
Work towards a society that actually...
If you're not pissed off, you're awfully callous.
It's not a consideration.
Like, it'd be irrational to not get pissed off about this.
I know it would. There's a hell of a lot of irrational people in the world who are putting their heads in the sand and just deciding that getting a whole bunch of money and influence is worth sacrificing half the human race.
Yeah, and the ones that don't die, the ones that manage to make it out of that death mill, we toy with them. We play with the rest of them, right? It's like how you have the big brother and he's got a little brother or little sibling or whatever, and he grabs the sibling's hands and makes him hit himself and stop hitting yourself. That's what feminists are doing. They've now taken control over the little brother, and they're continually making them punch themselves in the face and say, oh, you're doing it to yourself. All you have to do is stop.
Yeah, it's the male privilege, toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Sorry, you guys. Are you ready to hear how Amber Heard is victim of all of this? How she's victim of only having her lie be 40% effective, even after the use of a information mafia to promote it?
Yeah, we probably should get into it. Let's do it.
So just for how long this has been going on. It starts out 5 months ago. The verdict in the defamation trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard deeply concerned many professionals in the fields of intimate partner and sexual violence. As many, including A.O. Scott for the New York Times propaganda machine, have noted the vilification of Miss Heard and ongoing online harassment of her and those who have voiced support for her have been unprecedented in both vitriol and scale.
Well, I wonder who's doing all of that harassment, because wasn't it a Pew research that showed that online harassment mostly comes from other women?
Mm-hmm. Well, and let's think about this for a minute. Unprecedented.
Yeah.
Right? So no other woman has experienced has come out and told a lie on the scale that she's told and then experienced backlash for a lie that big. I'm sure that a certain literally who read this and went, they forgot about me, right? You know, and she didn't get harassment either, but I mean, she did make the claim, and the entire anti-Gamergate movement pretty much like said the same thing about her. And the entire media propaganda machine made out like she was the biggest victim of demonization and harassment to have ever lived. So they really just have a new toy here. Like they're done with that chick that looks like a Muppet, and are moving on to Cruella de Herd, and yeah, online harassment that consists of people not believing her, and then when her supporters get abusive, and they did get very abusive, pushing back against them. Much of this harassment was fueled by disinformation, misogyny, biphobia, and a monetized social media environment where a woman's allegations of domestic violence and sexual assault were mocked for entertainment.
Well, isn't it a good thing that that handy dandy trust and safety board were doing their job all along? Good
What?
God.
So, was she accusing the bee of domestic violence? The bee that, you know, her dog.
Oh God.
Seriously. Okay. We're not allowed to examine what a woman says. That's what this is. You can't examine what a woman says. You just have to take her at her word.
Oh.
And if that's not abusive, I don't know what is.
Yes, biphobia. Like, I wouldn't have ever known that Amber Heard was bisexual until somebody said it was biphobic to criticize her.
What?
Yeah, much of the harassment was fueled by disinformation, misogyny, biphobia.
Biphobia.
Oh God, I feel sorry for men and women then.
Yeah.
She's into both.
And apparently
nobody's safe.
Biphobic bisexuals who are intolerant of cheating on your partner, even when you cheat with the same sex. That's just, you know, how dare you?
Well, she had like a lineup going up.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Oh, believe me, that's a familiar story. We have an ex that, like, I didn't even date her. I still feel like she's my ex. So this similar behavior. Like, you know, that scene in Airplane, was it Airplane or Airplane 2, where the woman gets hysterical and like everybody lines up to slap her because
it's Airplane.
Movie scene.
That's Airplane 1. Yeah, it's Airplane 1.
Yeah, basically.
Like, I blend those together in my head a lot of times if I haven't watched them recently.
Wasn't there also a scene where there was a woman in one of the washrooms and there was a lineup?
Yeah, they might have done it in both. But in any case, yeah, that's kind of the way I picture it. And that's kind of what Heard was like too. And I'm sorry, but well, no, I'm not sorry. Like, there's a huge difference between criticizing someone for betraying their partner's trust versus calling someone a slut because they had multiple partners.
Yeah.
When you promise to be loyal to someone and then you don't, the problem isn't that you had multiple partners. The problem is that you promised to be loyal and you weren't, that you lied. And the Mont Bailey of using slut shaming, the idea of slut shaming as criticism for people who criticize cheaters is bullshit. It's just absolute bullshit. Everybody knows it isn't the sluttiness of cheating that people are upset about when they criticize that. It is the betrayal of the person who has been asked to trust you. And it hurts to get cheated on. And it damages the cheater too. It's demeaning to cheat on somebody that you promised to be loyal to. You make yourself a liar and a betrayer and a scumbag, really. But yeah.
I got
phobic to criticize a woman for cheating with another woman.
I have another super chow and a rumble rant. So NobaFan21 gives us $1 and says, propaganda machine. The patriarchy keeps women from having a voice. Also propaganda machine. This tiny men's rights group is a threat to all women.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that, NobaFan. And then Michael Emmerich Winberg gives us $5 and says, in other words, as the Queen Karen said at the UN, the daily grind of you're a liar and you suck do count as harassment. That's a reference to Anita Sarkeesian, I think. She was saying that, it's not just the instances of online harassment, but it's also like the daily grind of, you're a liar, you suck, which of course she's treating as harassment and abuse, even though her being a liar is a fact. And I don't know about the you suck part, but I will just kind of let that one lie and maybe see if it needs to be determined later. So anyway, those are the super...
I think that's correct.
Yeah. Those are the super chats and, super chows and rumble rants. Thank you guys. And now
I'm
we can...
sure.
Hmm?
And now we can move on.
Yeah.
I'm sure the guys that have Voice for Men that received beheading videos with the description, this should happen to you, are just sobbing into their keyboards in sympathy for Anita Sarkeesian, who got told you suck and you're a liar. Like, they probably have a huge amount of sympathy for that because, it's so much worse to be told that you suck and you're a liar than to have somebody suggest that you should be beheaded and send you a graphic depiction of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll finish this damn letter because I got things to say about the industry.
Well, so we're 2/3 of the way through the letter, and they haven't actually said anything about the case. They just complained about people being able to evaluate it and debate it, right? So now they're saying, in our opinion, the Depp versus Heard verdict and continued discourse around it indicate a fundamental misunderstanding of intimate partner and sexual violence and how survivors respond to it.
That's a lot of buzzwords just to say the following.
Yeah.
Only women are victims. Only men are perpetrators. Or rather, we know that men are also victims and women are also perpetrators. But we can't make money off of that. And recognizing it impacts our bottom line. So we are going to ignore it, even though that means that we end up not serving male victims, which, no one cares about that, but also means we end up not serving female victims.
Right.
The thing is that I now have evidence that when feminists started to get involved in these domestic violence projects and also like social interventions for rape and stuff, they changed or they challenged the science. So there are researchers out there who are looking into why the causal factors to, domestic violence and rape, and trying to develop interventions based on psychology and therapy, like real psychology and therapy, empirical psychology and therapy, to reduce the rate. In the 80s, feminists opposed this, ended up imposing this because it wasn't useful to their ideologies. And female victims and female survivors should get more angry about this, because what that means is they decided that it was less important to reduce the rate of rape and domestic violence. I mean, men against men is a non-starter, but against women, it was less important than to maintain their theories and ideologies and their money stream. I mean, let that sink in. Let that sink in. That isn't advocacy for women. That isn't advocacy for women as people. It isn't advocacy for women as victims. It is advocacy for women as cattle, as your cash crop, as a source of money. In other words, you can continue to suffer, women, as long as it, brings in the money and power to us.
Literally.
I mean, this goes beyond grifting,
maybe 100
into a level of perfidy that's unbelievable. Because, and when I was looking at all of this, because the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp case brought this up to the surface for me. The longest time I didn't make these connections, which was dumb because Hannah was making them right in front of me, and I was reading her stuff and I was like, oh yeah. But it never really clicked. It didn't click until, I think it was Ruth Glenn from the National Association Against Domestic Violence, that said the Amber Heard case, and when Johnny Depp started to fight back, was not a good thing for them because they didn't make money off of it. All of the other Me Too cases, they were making money hand over, but this one they didn't make money off of, so they don't like it.
Exactly.
But the other thing is that I looked deeper and deeper into this, into the financials of these feminist institutions, or these feminist NGOs, and I'm seeing this, and they are living very well off of this ideology. And you tie it back into the fact that they constructed this.
You muted yourself, Allison.
They constructed this entire system by marginalizing intervention work to reduce the rate of rape and domestic violence against women, not just against men, because we don't care about men, except for us here, but against women. They are literally making money off of women's suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and they have to perpetuate that suffering in order to keep making that money.
Yep. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, all right, I understand that they don't care about men, right? I understand that. I understand feminists don't care about men. They don't give a fuck about men. They have all these excuses and reasons to blame the situation, the problems that men face on men themselves, so that they can ignore them completely and just dismiss them from view. Fine. But how dare they not care about women? How fucking dare?
It's their whole shtick.
The reason
their whole shtick is a lie.
Their whole shtick is a fucking lie.
Yep.
Like, I mean, I understand they don't care about men. If somebody says, I'm not interested in the porpoise. I want to deal with the beluga. I'm not going to say, okay, well, you got to care about the porpoise because I care about the porpoise. Okay, you go advocate for the beluga. Who cares, right? At least you care about something and you're doing something positive. No, they don't care about women. All of these feminists who get up on stage and yap about this open letter, all of these professionals yapping about this, they are complicit in a system that is harming women while saying that they advocate for women. And I can tell you that this entire this case has really blown my mind wide open. I I always thought what you were talking about, Hannah, about the feminists using domestic violence as a grift to get money for their ideology. I was like, that's a little conspiracy. No, you're absolutely freaking right.
It's a huge grift. Big money machine. And they do the same thing with rape.
Yep.
Right? Intimate partner and sexual violence is their biggest money maker. They use other things too. Like they use the whole that they need the pay gap. They can't admit that the pay gap doesn't exist, that it's an earnings gap and it's based on people's choices that they have the right to make, because then they wouldn't be able to raise money for their organizations. And there's a propaganda machine around that as well. Feminism is a giant grift based on gynocentrism farming. They farm gynocentrism in every aspect of human relations and civil liberties and civil rights, and basically any relationship between the individual and the state. Like every issue, every feminist issue, every issue they describe, even the petty little stupid man-spreading and stuff like that's all a way to make money by exploiting your compassion for women and the fact that people have more compassion for women than they do for men. That's all it ever has been, and it's all it ever will be. Feminism was never a legitimate movement. It never cared about women. It never involved caring about women. It always involved demonizing men, and the people who promoted it, like from the very beginning, it was about selling books and getting political clout and developing organizations that were giant money laundering machines. Even back to the suffragettes, who, by the way, at least in the UK, were mad that they lost privilege over poor women. They didn't really care about politics. They cared about having something that poor women didn't. So there you go. And this is about defending that. They go on in the letter to say, the damaging consequences of the spread of this misinformation. Misinformation, by the way, is what they are referring to everyone being able to watch the hearing live as. You seeing what really happened instead of their narrative is misinformation. Mm-hmm. The spread of misinformation are incalculable. We have grave concerns about the rising misuse of defamation suits to threaten and silence survivors.
Oh, you mean when it doesn't go your way, then it's a problem, right? I mean, get the hell. And first off, with these goddamn weasel words, the damaging consequences. What consequences are we talking about? Some people have judged her case and found her to be a fucking liar. People don't agree with her. They think that she's a horrible person. Well, that's kind of what happens. That's I'm sorry. You want to come forward and accuse somebody of doing some horrible things to you, and you go through the justice system, and lo and behold, it doesn't work out in your favor. That doesn't mean that you're then a victim.
She didn't really go through the justice system. She went immediately to media.
Well, yeah,
and
true.
And it worked out entirely in her favor for 6 years, up until the justice system did get involved, at least the civil justice system. And then somebody put a stop to it. And she even got like a court. Okay, no, actually, it wasn't her, sir. I don't want to perpetuate this misinformation. It was not. Johnny Depp was not suing Amber Heard in the UK. He was suing the Sun. And the only thing the Sun had to do was prove that they had they could act on what she said reasonably. So it's a much lower burden of proof,
right?
Because all they have to prove is that they genuinely believe. That's it. That's all. As a media outlet, all they have to prove is that, yeah, credible. She seems credible, so we went with it. And they don't have to prove much beyond that. It's a very low burden of proof.
They don't even have to prove that she had evidence. They only had to prove that they were not presented with evidence against what she said. So which means the case, like feminists will reference the son as if it is proof of abuse. It wasn't proof of anything other than the fact that all a woman has to do is make an allegation and the media will just run with it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah,
and not to change gears here or anything, but it's really interesting what they find credible. And we couldn't find anything credible about Hunter Biden's laptop for how long, and that was completely disinformation. Just look the other way. It didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. Anyway.
Well, and it's a 7 years in hell case. There were local organizations that published articles about this is the other thing. I don't know of any other case like this. Like, I know that there have been a couple of defamation cases against rape accusers whose accusations were not proved, right? So those may be perfectly legitimate, but all the evidence indicates that they were not legitimate allegations, and they got sued for defamation, and that's fair. If you make a public allegation against somebody and it's a lie, that is defamation, right? In the 7 years in hell case, the way that the victim stopped the malicious prosecution by his ex was to file a vexatious litigant claim against her in civil court. And it took 2 years to go through because the clerk of courts, quote, lost the complaint for a year until his lawyer threatened to sue. And then when it finally went through and she was found to be a vexatious litigant and she can't do anything to him anymore, that was addressed by an article by one of the local organizations that supports women like her as a trend. And this looks the same, like this disturbing trend of men using the legal system to defend themselves against false allegations. That's what they're upset about. You know, this disturbing trend of men using vexatious litigation civil suit the way that it was intended to be used to stop vexatious litigation and malicious prosecution. Men using defamation suits to stop defamation. How dare they? Don't they know that's not for them? They're not the aristocracy. Women are. So
those are my toys. You can't play with them.
Yeah. So then they finish up with, "We condemn the public shaming of Amber Heard and join in support of her. We support the ability of all to report intimate partner and sexual violence, free of harassment and intimidation." Except if they're men, you know, that's a different story.
Right.
Apparently, these were signed by a whole bunch of feminist organizations.
Yep.
The Women's March Action, the Women's March Foundation, Ms. Magazine, Esperanza United. I'm not going to list them all, but...
no, you're not.
It goes on. It goes on.
I know. They even said that, it just goes on. They even said that, like, Gloria Steinem signed it. So we're looking at, like, the top brass of man-haters. That was, essentially, like, putting their name on this. Which, by the way, it's not a good letter. Like, it's really shallow and there's nothing
melodramatic.
Here. No substance, no, arguments. It's just the same shit. And yet, this got tons of support from a certain, let's say, group of people with a certain kind of influence. So,
people would call them man-haters, but from what I'm seeing, what's actually happening is this. They're just the latest iteration of sacrificing men in order to make money or advance a political agenda. And I don't think these women give a fuck about women.
No.
At all.
No, they give a fuck about their grift.
Yeah, that's it.
And by the way, the Women's March signed it twice. Women's March Action and the Women's March Foundation.
Good Lord. So somebody put water on them and they're multiplying. Oh my God.
Don't feed them after midnight, guys. Don't feed them after midnight.
Oh, talk about multiplying. Like, I did just a casual survey of the board members of these organizations, and I noticed that sometimes there would be multiple board members of different organizations, and the board members wouldn't be making like enough to report to the IRS. So they would, like, there's a cutoff at $50,000 a year. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, but what if you're part of 10 of these organizations and each one you're making about 20, 30, 40,000 a year for a half an hour's worth of work a year?
Exactly.
And there's a bunch of different things. Like Anita Sarkeesian is still making money. You know, we got a letter from somebody a while back that sort of checked into her. She made money advising companies and everything in the past, but now she's got speaking fees.
Yeah, she was rich before though. Like, I mean, she's
still making money on this.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't hear her name all the time anymore. Like, she's not prevalent in the discussion of what's going on in terms of, you know, gaming and gender politics and all. She's not in the forefront. You don't see her face, right?
No.
She is still capitalizing on it.
Yeah, she's in the industry now. She doesn't have to make public appearances.
But my point is, you don't fade into irrelevance. You just stop getting talked about in this situation. The Mary Sue signed on to this letter. Somebody asked, where's the Mary Sue? They're like right in the middle of the page, actually. They're closer to the bottom. But they signed on.
The White Ribbon Campaign makes a notable appearance as well.
Well, that one doesn't surprise me. They're rabid. But the Mary Sue is a publication about nerd stuff. It doesn't actually have this grift as part of its face, right? It's not even supposed to be about domestic anything. It's about, you know, women in Star Wars and crap like that. But they signed on to it. Like, these organizations, this networking. Do you remember when early on in Gamergate, how Milo Yiannopoulos entered into Gamergate by exposing the mailing list, the narrative mailing list that he was in, where various journalists would get their story straight before they published it. This is that kind of group. These people are all in communication with each other. These people are all getting their story straight before they publish it. If there's a letter like this going on, they're all going to sign it. You're going to see them all. And they'll move money around between organizations. And you're right, Allison, there will be people who are involved in multiple of these organizations. Or one organization will pay people from another organization to act at an advisory capacity. So you see Feminist Frequency is still in existence. And if Feminist Frequency may be getting contracted to advise some companies on this or that, then they may also get speaking fees from these organizations. And yet there will be people involved in Feminist Frequency who will be members of these organizations. It's all very incestuous and so on.
And they are making, like, I did some numbers, I ran some numbers. You know, like, for example, the NAA, the Association Against Domestic Violence, run by Ruth Glenn. I mean, I guess she takes a reasonable amount, about 100, I think 50 or 60 a year. But she has 6 or 7 board members who make something like, well, less than 50,000, but enough that she's paying out about I think half of 600,000 a year in terms of board or in terms of salaries to her board.
Now, do you recall during the hearing the expert witness for Amber Heard's side that came out and talked about all the different organizations that she was involved with, and before she started talking about how that like she was on the board of several different organizations. And just imagine if being on the board of an organization pays you $20,000 a year, but you're on the board of 5 different organizations. That's $100,000 a year, right?
Yeah, doing like a half hour a year consultancy.
Right.
Like,
or maybe even they have
even
they have a meeting every month, but that's once a month. So maybe you go to 5 meetings a month and you make $100,000.
Yes, that's what's going on. That's where all this money is going. This money that's supposed to go to help women is going to pay women or these individuals salaries that are unbelievable. Like 12 is what I was calculating. And we're not talking about like they're doing like an hour a month, right?
Right.
An hour a month. They're making like $12,000 an hour. What the hell are you even doing an hour?
Yeah, and you have a meeting about something like that.
Yeah, you have a meet. You have some frappuccinos with your friend down in the coffee house.
Yeah, when you have a meeting about stuff like that,
$1,200 for that.
The majority of the time for an organization like that, the majority of time spent in a meeting for something like that is how are we doing? These are the numbers. Okay, everything's kosher. Meeting's over. And once in a while, it's we're going to do this new thing. Or we have to do a new thing. What are we going to do? And they might spend a few minutes discussing that, and they come up with something. It's not
numbers here.
Yeah, it's not real work.
It's not real work. I'm looking at the output. For example, the National Association for Against Domestic Violence. Their output is an hour and a half seminar a month. Maintains a mailing list and does referrals. I'm pretty sure that's pretty much it. And and she has some pamphlets that haven't been updated since like the 2000s, I think, like the early 2000s, and which she sends out. This is it.
At least the one here in Dayton that screwed over the 7 years in hell guy actually has a shelter. They don't let men in there, but they do have a shelter.
Yeah, but a lot of these places don't even have a shelter. And I'm not, it's fine. If you're just informational, you're just raising, but that's an hour and a half seminar a month. That's it. 1.5 hours a seminar a month, pamphlets, a mailing list, and referrals. And that's it. And that is $600,000 a year worth for that.
Yeah.
Unless they're omitting some I don't know, secret domestic violence mines that they run somewhere. That's all they're giving the world.
For 2022, the president's budget for the Office on Violence Against Women totals $1 billion. $1 billion.
My God.
Right?
It's all going to these things.
I just want to give you some figures here. Only 16% of all relationships have any violence, any domestic violence. So 3/4 of relationships are just fine in terms of how they handle conflict. And in fact, more than 4/5. Right? 16% have some violence. And that includes everything from people yelling at each other to severe violence, right? So some of those aren't really even situations where the couple actually needs to split up. They can go to a marriage counselor, learn how to better handle conflict with each other, and move on. So you have the even smaller percentage where there's real violence, somebody's in danger and stuff like that. And again, 2/3 of domestic violence that is two-way and 70% of domestic violence that is one-way is female initiated, female perpetrated. And so essentially men are being targeted most of the time. Only a third of that 16% of relationships, 1/3 of 16%, very tiny percentage there, is initiated by guys, right? And half of that third is so 1/6 of 16% is the Duluth model or anything close to the Duluth model. But we have $1 billion pointing at the Duluth model, saying this is how we're going to handle domestic violence. Going to these organizations, many of which don't have shelters, they won't get anybody out of the relationship. All they do is teach police and prosecutors and judges and bailiffs, anybody else involved in the system, that 1/6 of 16% is the norm in domestic violence and in heterosexual relationships, and that's the emergency that they need to deal with.
Because it makes money.
Right. And
that's the narrative. The narrative
1 billion.
of the brutal man makes money.
1 billion going to those board members and speakers who go to universities and tell students that men are predatory and consent has to be ongoing and verbal and enthusiastic. But even if it is, if she regrets it later, he was a rapist, and even if he was passed out drunk, he was the rapist. Like those people are making that money.
Yeah, it's not even and what's really egregious is actually, maybe I should be okay with the ones who do basically nothing. Like they just sit on boards, go get frappuccinos, and make $100,000 a year. And that's all they do. They're not even going and talking to or going and counseling. And it's just mind-boggling. Like I'm talking about for a 1.5-hour seminar, pamphlets, a mailing list, and referrals.
Mm-hmm.
$600,000.
Unbelievable.
A year.
And creating educational materials is not that hard. I've done it. And I've done it. You don't.
They're
for me
created for decades.
And the thing is, you have to, in with real things like photography and dealing with research that actually uses the scientific method and explaining issues and so on to people, you have to deal with the truth, right? These guys can just make shit up. So their education materials can be entirely off the top of their heads. They don't have to stick to the facts. They don't, none of that. They can just spitball and make money off of that. And then that's that end of it, right? There's another end of the grift, and that is paid research, funded research, because the Violence Against Women Act funding includes a shitload of money going toward research and evaluation to perpetuate the Duluth model myths. Or as they put it, to study the scope and impact of teen dating violence, intimate partner violence, stalking and sexual assault, and identify evidence-based strategies for serving victims of these crimes and holding offenders accountable. And this has been going on since 1994. The federal government has spent millions, billions of dollars paying people to do what Mary P. Koss did. Design fake research by using false framing and presumed information rather than real facts to create a narrative, and then claiming that it is scientifically proven because they present it as such and then cite it in later examples of the same grift. And that's how we end up with this open letter and this bunch of organizations that are all interconnected with each other, doing this shit.
Yeah, I mean, if we actually their assertions and one of their lies, the whole house of cards falls down. And here's the thing, like, it shouldn't just be male victims that are pissed off at this. This gigantic fatberg is essentially is absorbing all kinds of resources that should be going to female victims. At the very least, we could be helping female victims, right? We can't help male victims. We've been helping some victims. You know, if we can't help the purposes, can we at least help the belugas? No. All of this is going to these incredible salaries, to this network of pork, and to interventions that don't work because they don't look at half the data or actually even set the 3/4 of the data, and to squeezing out interventions because they don't enable this gigantic flow of money. Because nobody, and part of it is, it's not just the feminists, part of it is the average person. The average person, if you say to them, hey, we have a problem of wife beating, they're like, take my money, take it, take all of it, take my money. I will do everything I can to stop it. But if we say, you know, there's a problem of domestic violence and it's not just, you know, female victims, they're like, oh, well, I don't really need to care. There's also male victims who, you know, it's like as soon as the male victims come into the picture, nobody gives a fuck anymore. Yeah. And this is on everyone. It's not just on feminists. Feminists are exploiting the average person's lack of concern for men. And the lack of concern for men, ironically, leads to a situation where they can actually exploit female victims. And what do we do?
There's one more point I want to make about this, and it's important in that we frequently, as a movement, have to deal with denial of it. Right? The media that's reporting on this didn't say organizations for victims when they talked about this. They said feminist organizations. So when you hear that it's not feminists, it's toxic masculinity that is responsible when male victims of domestic violence speak out and people don't listen and they don't have recourse and they get condemned as abusers for defending themselves. You can point to this. No. Johnny Depp defended himself in court and he was accused of abuse for doing it. And it was feminist organizations, some of whom aren't even overtly involved in the domestic violence victims advocacy grift, right? Some of them are just feminist organizations. And they're the ones that came out in support of Amber Heard. Not domestic violence victims advocates, not other men coming out and saying, we believe her because she's a woman. You know, like not male cops. Nobody said, nice. It was feminist organizations. This is a feminist grift. It is run by feminists. Feminists make a profit from it. Feminists keep it going. Feminists defend it against evidence of their wrongdoing. This is feminism. And yeah, there are women who are not feminist who are also involved. Women are not innocent in this, right? But it is organized feminist lobbying and organized feminist propaganda campaigns and organized feminist grifters who are the hurdle that we have to fight every day in order to get any help for men. When men make headway and there's a huge protest or a huge effort to claw back compassion from men, it's feminist organizations that lead the way. Feminism is responsible. And no, you can't say not all feminists, because holy fuck, look at the list. Right? These are the who's who of feminism. These are, and this list is long. Beneath the actual graphics representing these feminist organizations is a list of names, and it's more people. It's not the same. It's not just the names of the graphics above. It's other groups. Although there are some. Nope, there's some that are doubled up. But no, this is a long list.
It is longer than the article, might I add. The nine sentences that they managed to piddle together. It's longer list than that. It's absurd, just absolutely absurd.
Yeah. So I don't want to hear again. Feminism didn't do this. This isn't feminism's fault. This is toxic masculinity. My toxic masculinity. If you look for toxic masculinity, people would believe him. No, it's you. It's feminism.
Lock, stock, and barrel. Lock, stock, and fucking barrel.
What's interesting about feminism is that feminists use the label because people think that means that you're advocating for women. And you can appropriate the social cachet of being seen to advocate for women as women when you call yourself a feminist. And what's actually happening is right here, we're seeing these women who are calling themselves feminists are exploiting that perception that they advocate for women in order to do things that will really only advocate for themselves, for their own self-interest, their own money, their own political power, their own network pork. And so I would say that what's happening, if we want to allow that feminism that was ever really about equality, and I will say that I did identify as a feminist. I identified with those aspects about feminism that I thought were about equality between men and women. So I thought to myself, well, what would be expected of a man in this situation? And I always tried to do that. And but then I realized that that's not how the majority of feminists around me are using the term. They're using the term to give greater credence to their arguments, because when they say they're a feminist argument, they're basically saying, I am advocating for women as women, therefore I am tying into our social instinct to protect and provide for women. It's very powerful stuff. But I think what we're seeing is that people who are inherently selfish and self-interested and want lots of money and lots of influence are using the label. And I'm not, and honestly, at this point, I don't even know what is good about the label, but they are using the label to say, I am advocating for women. If you help me, you're helping the greatest number of women. And then at the same time as they're saying that, what I've been telling you about is they are actually turning around and ensuring more female suffering, more depredations that women face, more raped women, more abused women. So it's like astounding to me to watch this process. And it is because we have a label like feminism that this is possible. And I would argue that you can't actually say that you are a person. Nobody should have the ability to say advocates for the greatest number of, or for women as women. Because every time that happens, they're hiding self-interest and they're lying about it.
Yep.
So it's like, I don't know, like on the one hand, me believing in the idea of feminism as bringing equality between the sexes and saying, well, then I am responsible for acting with equality towards men. There's on that one hand, but as far as I can tell, I looked around myself and I was the only feminist. And I'm like, well, why am I carrying to manipulate people into thinking that they advocate for all women, which is impossible, because get this, women are individuals and women have differences. And then not only that, to come to the realization that they say this while doing the exact opposite. Like, how can I hand these women more power by using their label? You know, how can I give them more credence when this is what I'm seeing, what they're doing with it? And then I don't see anybody else who, at that time, I didn't see anybody else who labeled themselves as a feminist who thought in terms that I did. As in, I'm a woman, how can I bring about equality for men as, you know, bring about equality for men? You know, that led me to the men's rights movement.
Yeah.
That led me to questioning gynocentrism. But it started with the feminist thought about equality. I didn't start from a conservative position. I started from how to bring about equality between men and women. I don't even know if that's even possible. But that's where I started on my route towards advocating for men's issues. So I don't know.
See, I'm almost the opposite. I started from a position of traditionalism. And I don't know whether I could call my parents truly conservative. Like, they call themselves conservative, but they did the thing, you know, when I was a kid, they bought me trucks and stuff like that to play with. I had Tonka trucks and stuff like that, and I had Barbies too. You know, like we're gonna let our daughter to choose what kind of things that she likes to do. One of my earliest, not exactly playthings, my first tool that I received was a camera, an Olympus Pen E half frame. At 2 years old, my dad put a camera in my hands, started teaching me photography. Right? They were very liberal about stuff like that, and they were Democrats before they were they were Reagan Democrats. That's a short way to put it. If you read about the Reagan Democrats, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But my family was always very traditional in the true sense, not in the neo-tradcon sense where they think women lived like June Cleaver before the 70s. Because I didn't come from a upper class family. I came from a family of like farmers and teachers and truckers and nurses and stuff like that. So my family members all worked. But it was you take care of your family, you're loyal to the family. Both the husband and the wife are invested in the welfare of the family, and they take on roles. They agree with each other and take on roles to promote the welfare of the family, and you don't complain about those roles because you've chosen them. And so as I start learning about women's issues and feminism as I'm going through school, nothing feminists said rang true. And then at the ripe old age of 13, after I'd gone through a few years of sex education, learning about gestation and so on, what it looks like, what the baby looks like at different stages and everything, and being the granddaughter of one of the foremost experts in the country on children with disabilities, I learned what abortion was and how abortion advocates use the idea of euthanizing children with disabilities to promote their grift. And like, obviously I was never going to sign on for that. Like, the moment it was described to me in that way, that was it. I was pro-life for life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, so feminism couldn't get its hooks into me because of where I came from. And I think that's probably partly why I've always been able to see through shit like this. That they've never been about helping women, that they've always been about making their own money. and there's a degree of hate involved. They hate men for the sake of hating men. They hate women for the sake of making money.
Yep.
They hate men for the sake of hating men. And you can see it in every aspect of their ideology. When you read feminist writing about men, the one good thing I will say about Andrea Dworkin is that at least she was honest about her opinions. She didn't sugarcoat things. She didn't try to pretend that she was helping men. She just flat out hated them. And I can respect that she didn't try to lie about it. I wish other feminists would stop trying to lie about it.
Right.
So there we go.
So it's like, I was just gonna say.
I think we've killed the letter. So
yeah, it's totally dead. And also, I have to leave like really soon here.
And it's 9:00.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, because I have to go pick up Lindsay. But I do have 2 super chows. I think I'll read them, and then we can wrap it up if that's okay. So
yes.
Okay, so Nova Fan gives us $5 and writes, I was wondering what the end goal for feminist organizations. I'm thinking it's similar to women who marries her way into wealth and the ability to nudge her political husband into doing anything to maintain her comfort and lifestyle. But I'm wondering if it would be something else. Could it be similar to slavery, where the women on top are the slave owners of men? Would it be similar to the Empire in Star Wars, where men are not only powerless to women, but that the women would have the power to wipe out any number of men for any reason? I don't buy into the normie idea that anything feminists did regarding women's shelters or domestic abuse shelters is somehow progress, because the women in charge can donate more into shelters if they cared that much. Well,
you think about it, for $1 billion, with the number of women, just if you even didn't care about men at all, just the number of women who might need to get out of abusive relationships, like, our government could just fund putting them in new housing. They wouldn't need all these organizations.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that most of these feminists think that far ahead, Nova Fan, to be honest. I think that they're just looking to enjoy the grift for as long as it lasts. And that's it. I don't think this is about building an all-female empire. I think they'll joke about that stuff, but they're not really interested in doing that, because they just want to milk the teat for as long as they can and use these narratives to maintain that, but they don't really have a final image of what their utopia looks like. It's basically they're having a conversation about having a conversation, which is the way that utopians basically describe it, right? So
right.
Once we have everything, then we will start to talk about what to do next, but we don't know what that is right now. Michael Emmerich Winberg gives us $5 and says, pray allow me to disagree. Feminism is not to blame for this as much as unacknowledged gynocentrism and female power. And part of this is the concept that if you try to mention that women hold power, they can abuse or misuse, people's brains fizzle out and see it as a judgment of women's character rather than acknowledgement of their power.
It's like saying that the construction company is not as much to blame for the house being built as the lumber and the nails. Those are things that feminists exploit. Feminism is absolutely responsible for this, because it's feminists that did the lobbying. It's feminists that supported candidates getting into office that would listen to their lobbying, and it's feminists that got the laws passed. It's feminists that engage in the grift, that that receive the money from the government, use the money to promote these ideas, and disseminate those materials and everything. It's feminists that run the organizations that take women to court to break up their marriages and throw their husbands out into the street. It's feminists that show them how to exploit the law to get every last little penny they can out of the guy, and take his children away from him, and destroy his entire life. It's not people's gynocentrism. Like, you could be next door to somebody and be gynocentric your entire life, and no laws will get passed. No organization will send somebody to sit in a courtroom with a liar and tell the witnesses for the other side that they have to sit sideways on the bench because she's afraid they might be looking at her. Right? That's not, you cannot absolve feminists of responsibility for the specific actions they have taken by citing social attitudes. Social attitudes do absolutely nothing without the actions of people, and feminists are 100% responsible for those actions. So was that all the super chats?
That's
and
it.
Other chats? Alrighty.
Yep. That's everything.
Well, in that case, thanks guys for sticking out this sleazy letter and the discussion that we needed to have around it. Thanks again, Brian, for all your help with this. Thanks to everybody who listened to the show, and thanks to everybody who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. And good night, all.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.